I buried my Amish husband last year. The first thing I did after shocked my family. Ahem. The morning after we buried Jonas, I walked to the end of our lane, turned left instead of right, and kept walking until I reached the county road. My daughter Ruth found me 3 hours later sitting inside a public library in Millersburg, holding a library card with my own name on it. She stood in the doorway with her hand over her mouth like I had committed a crime. I was 58 years old, and it was the first card of any kind that had ever carried my name alone. That was 1 year ago. I have not stopped reading since. But to explain why a library card could shake my family apart, I need to go back much further than last spring. I need to go back to the winter I was 17, when my father told me a man named Jonas Hirschberger had asked permission to court me. In our district in Holmes County, Ohio, courting was not what the English imagine. There were no long conversations. Jonas came to our home on Sunday evenings. He sat in the front room with my father. I brought coffee and walnut cake. He looked at me twice during the first visit, 3 times during the second. By the 4th visit, my father told me Jonas was a good man with 60 acres and a clean reputation. I understood what that meant. We married the following November. I was 18. Jonas was 31. I moved into his farmhouse the same day, carrying one trunk my mother had packed. She held my face between her hands at the door and said, "Learn his ways quickly, Miriam. A peaceful home is a woman's first duty." I thought she was giving me love. I did not recognize it as a warning. The first winter was quiet. Jonas was not cruel in the way the English might picture cruelty. He never raised his hand. He never shouted. He simply had a structure for everything, and he expected that structure to hold without discussion. Meals at precise times, clothing folded in a specific order, the garden planted according to his mother's pattern, the house cleaned on his schedule. I adjusted. I thought adjusting was love. Now, from where I sit today, in this small apartment above a hardware store in town, with 17 library books stacked beside my bed, I understand what that first winter actually was. It was training, and I was a willing student because no one had told me there was any other way to be a wife. By our 2nd year, I noticed something. Jonas did not read the Bible aloud during evening devotions the way other husbands did. He recited from memory. At first I admired this. Then I realized the pages of our family Bible were glued shut in places. Not all of them, just certain sections. When I asked about it, he said dampness had damaged the binding and I should not force the pages open. I believed him. I had no reason not to. But there was something else. We had no books in the house besides that Bible, a hymnal, and a farm almanac. This was not unusual for an Amish home. What was unusual was the rule Jonas explained to me one evening in January of that 2nd year. He told me that in our household I was not to read anything he had not first approved. Not a letter, not a newspaper, not a pamphlet from the feed store. He said reading was a doorway for confusion, and a wife's mind should remain undivided. I accepted this. I want you to understand. I accepted this because he said it gently, because our bishop's wife nodded when I mentioned it at a quilting circle, because my own mother said, "Jonas knows what keeps a home in order." I had no framework for calling it what it was. The years accumulated. I bore 4 children, 3 daughters and a son. I raised them according to Jonas's structure. They attended our district school through 8th grade, as expected. But I noticed that Jonas removed certain books from the schoolhouse when he served on the school board. He told the teacher, a young woman named Anna Byler, that specific readers contained ideas unsuitable for plain children. Anna complied. Everyone complied with Jonas. He had a way of framing every restriction as protection. I want to tell you about something that happened in our 11th year of marriage. My daughter Ruth was 7. She came home from school carrying a small book of poems another child had lent her. Simple poems about birds, snow, growing things. She showed it to me with such brightness in her face. I held that book for perhaps 2 minutes, reading one poem about a January sparrow. Then Jonas came through the kitchen door. He did not raise his voice. He took the book from my hands, told Ruth that borrowed books must be returned immediately, and walked it back to the schoolhouse himself. That night, after the children were sleeping, he told me that I had failed to protect our daughter's mind. He said my weakness was the reason he maintained the rule. He said, if I leave a door open, Miriam, you will walk through it. That is why I must keep the doors closed. I did not argue. I folded the dish towel and placed it on the counter and said nothing. That silence lasted 27 more years. From where I sit now, I can see that evening clearly. I can see myself standing at that counter, the towel still warm from the stove rail. I can see how small the cage was, but at the time it did not feel like a cage. It felt like marriage. It felt like obedience. It felt like what God required. Over the decades, I found small ways to read. I memorized the labels on canning jars at the general store. I read the weather reports pinned to the post office board while Jonas loaded feed. I read the inscriptions inside sympathy cards before passing them to him for approval. These fragments were not enough. They were like breathing through a straw. But I did not let myself name what I was doing. If I named it, I would have to admit that my husband's rule was something I needed to escape. When I was 43, something changed. My mother was dying. I sat beside her bed for 6 days while she faded. On the 4th day, when we were alone, she gripped my wrist and said, "There is a box in the cellar, behind the canning shelves. It was mine before your father. Do not let anyone take it." She died the next morning. I waited 2 weeks before I went to her cellar. Behind the shelves, wrapped in oilcloth, I found a wooden box containing 11 books, novels, poetry, a book about the history of Ohio, a dictionary with my mother's maiden name written inside the cover. These books were older than her marriage. She had owned them as a girl, before she joined the church, before she married my father. She had hidden them for over 40 years. I knelt on that cellar floor and wept, not because the books were precious, though they were, because my mother had lived the same starvation I was living, and she had never told me. She had looked at me across kitchen tables for 25 years, knowing what Jonas's rule was doing to me, and she had said nothing except keep the peace. I took 3 of the books home. I hid them inside the lining of a winter quilt stored in the attic. For the next 15 years, I read those 3 books over and over, always when Jonas was in the barn or the fields. I read them so many times that I wore the ink pale on certain pages. They were not remarkable books. One was a novel about a school teacher. One was a collection of poems by a woman I later learned was Emily Dickinson. One was the Ohio history. But they kept something alive inside me that I cannot name precisely, some sense that my mind was still my own. Jonas never found them, or perhaps he never looked. His system depended on my compliance, and I had given him no reason to doubt it. 5 years ago, Jonas was diagnosed with a cancer in his stomach. He declined slowly over 14 months. I cared for him completely, bathed him, fed him, turned him in the bed, changed his dressings. I did this without resentment. I want to be honest about that. Whatever Jonas had taken from me, he was still the man I had shared a bed with for nearly 4 decades. He was still my children's father. I did not wish him a painful death. But during those 14 months, something shifted in my thinking. As Jonas grew weaker, I began to imagine what would exist on the other side of his life. Not with joy, not with impatience, but with a quiet, growing clarity. I realized that when he was gone, no one would be standing between me and the written word. The rule would end because the man who made it would be gone. He died on a Tuesday in March. We buried him that Thursday. The community gathered in our home afterward. Food, coffee, silence, hymns. My children surrounded me. The bishop spoke about Jonas's faithfulness. My son-in-law managed the farm chores. Everyone assumed I would grieve quietly and remain in the house, tending the garden, keeping Jonas's structure alive out of habit or devotion. The next morning, I woke before dawn. I dressed, I walked down the lane, and I turned left. The Millersburg Public Library opened at 9 o'clock. I was waiting on the bench outside when the librarian unlocked the door. I told her I wanted a library card. She asked for identification. I had none. I had never in my life possessed a document with only my name on it. No license, no bank card, no insurance paper. Everything had been in Jonas's name or my father's name before him. The librarian, a woman about my daughter's age, looked at me carefully. She asked if I had a piece of mail. I had brought one thing, the electric bill from the previous month, which had been transferred to my name after Jonas's death. She accepted it. She typed my name into her computer. She handed me a small blue card. Miriam Hirschberger. I held it in both hands, and I could not speak for a moment. I chose 4 books that first morning. I sat at a table near the window and read for 2 hours. I did not know how to use the catalog system. I simply walked along the shelves and pulled whatever my hands reached for. A novel about a woman who sailed alone, a book about the Civil War, a collection of short stories, a guide to wildflowers of Ohio. When Ruth found me, she was frightened. Not angry, frightened. She said, "Ma'am, what are you doing here? People will see." I looked at my daughter and understood that she had inherited the same fear Jonas had cultivated in me. She believed that a woman sitting in a library was doing something dangerous. I told her, "I am reading, Ruth. I am going to read every day now." She drove me home in silence. That evening, she called her sisters. The next day, all 3 daughters came to the house. They sat around my kitchen table and spoke to me as though I were ill. They asked if I was confused. They asked if grief had made me unwell. They reminded me that our community did not approve of worldly reading. They told me that people were already talking, that the bishop's wife had seen me walking toward town. My son did not come. He sent a message through Ruth. "Tell her to remember who she is." I listened to my daughters. I made them coffee, and then I said something I had never said aloud in my entire life. I said, "Your father did not allow me to read. Not a single page in 39 years. That rule is finished." The silence that followed was the loudest sound I have ever heard in that kitchen. Ruth began to cry. My second daughter, Leah, stood up and left without a word. My youngest, Hannah, stared at me and said, "Dad was protecting you." I recognized those words. They were his words, living inside my daughter's mouth. I did not argue with her. There was nothing I could say that a single year of watching me would not say better. Within a month, I was walking to the library 3 times a week. Within 2 months, the bishop visited my home. He told me that my behavior was causing concern. He said a widow should seek comfort in scripture and community, not in English books. I thanked him for his concern. I did not stop. By autumn, the whispers had become a kind of verdict. Several women in the district stopped speaking to me at church. My son did not bring his children to visit. Ruth came weekly, but always with worry in her eyes, as though she expected to find me transformed into someone unrecognizable. And perhaps I was transforming, not into someone new, into someone I had been before Jonas closed the doors. I read about history. I read about science. I read novels that described lives I would never live but could finally imagine. I read poetry that gave language to feelings I had carried silently for decades. I was not leaving the faith. I was not leaving the community. I was simply refusing to live any longer with a locked mind. 6 months after Jonas's death, I found something. I was cleaning the attic, sorting his papers, when I discovered a small metal box behind the chimney bricks. Inside were letters, 17 of them, written in Jonas's hand, addressed to our bishop over a span of 20 years. They were copies he had kept. In these letters, Jonas reported on my behavior. He noted when I lingered too long at the store. He noted when I read a seed catalog without his permission. He noted when I asked Anna Byler about a book at the school. Each letter assured the bishop that he was managing the situation, that I was not becoming worldly, that his household remained in order. He had been reporting on me for 20 years, as though I were a danger that required surveillance. I sat on the attic floor holding those letters, and I felt something I had never allowed myself to feel during his lifetime. I felt anger, clean, bright, justified anger. Not for the reading he stole from me, though that was enough, but for the way he made my natural hunger for knowledge into evidence of spiritual failure. He turned my mind into a sin that needed monitoring. I burned those letters in the wood stove that evening. I watched each one curl into ash. Then I walked to the shelf and pulled my mother's 3 books from inside the quilt where they had lived for 15 years. I placed them on the kitchen table in plain view. They have remained there ever since. It has been 1 year now. My relationship with my children is complicated. Ruth has begun visiting the library herself, though she does not tell her husband. Leah has not spoken to me in 9 months. Hannah writes me letters. She moved to Indiana with her husband's family, and in her most recent letter, she asked me to recommend a book. My son remains distant, but last month he allowed his eldest daughter to visit me alone. She is 14. She asked to borrow one of my books. I gave her the Emily Dickinson. I am not a radical woman. I am not angry at my faith. I am not trying to change my community. I am simply a 59-year-old woman who spent nearly 4 decades being told that her own mind was dangerous, and who decided, on the first morning of her freedom, to prove that it was not. The library card sits in a small dish on my windowsill. It is the most ordinary object in the world, and it is the most precious thing I have ever owned. Some mornings, when the light comes through the glass and catches the edge of that blue card, I think of my mother kneeling in her cellar, wrapping her books in oilcloth, hiding the fact that she had once been a girl who loved to read. I did not hide. That is the difference. That is the one thing I did after burying my husband that my family could not understand. I simply stopped hiding.